Welcome on board, chosen one. Look at you carrying a list of things that went wrong for no reason anybody could explain. When it fell through, when it got cancelled, when something obstructed you at the last possible moment, and you spent the whole day furious about it, and never once got an explanation. Look at where you would have been standing. Look at what was arriving there. Look at what an annoyance is actually for. Hit that like button and subscribe to pay this energy back and push this message to every chosen one who's been cursing the thing that saved them. Here's the mechanism, and once you have it, a set of bad days reorganize themselves. Something went wrong, small, ordinary, and infuriating. A delay, a cancellation, a thing that fell through at the last moment for no reason anybody could name. An obstruction that made no sense, delivered by somebody who couldn't explain it either, and who seemed almost as puzzled by it as you were. And you were angry, properly angry, out of proportion to the thing, for a day or a week. Then you moved on, and it became one of those small stories you tell about how nothing ever goes smoothly for you. That event was not an obstacle, it was a relocation, and it moved you off a spot that something else was about to arrive at a time you had no way of knowing anything was arriving anywhere. Here's the part nobody explains, and it's the whole design. It had to come as an annoyance. Nothing else would have moved you. Think about it properly, because this is the part that decides whether any of the rest of this holds. A warning wouldn't have worked, because a warned person stays and watches. They go to the place and look for the thing they were warned about, which is the exact opposite of the required outcome. An explanation wouldn't have worked either. An explained obstruction becomes something to argue with, to work around, to insist on. Give somebody a reason and they'll assess the reason, and half the time they'll decide it isn't good enough and proceed anyway. The only thing that reliably moves a person out of a position is an irritation, small enough to be believable, large enough to be obeyed, and completely unexplained, so there's nothing to argue with. There was a time when you'd have called this making excuses for things simply going wrong. You've been level-headed about your life. You've assumed that things going wrong is simply what happens, that there's no pattern in it, and that looking for one is what people do when they can't accept randomness. Go back through the things that went wrong, though, properly, and look at what each one moved you away from rather than what it stopped you doing. That's a different accounting entirely, and almost nobody has ever run it, because nothing in anybody's upbringing suggests that the direction of an obstruction is the interesting part of it. And hey, chosen one, yes you, drop a comment with the number 777, not for superstition, not for good fortune, as a signal to the universe that you're ready to look at your obstructions differently. Because there's a particular kind of person who stays to the end of a message like this one. Most people scroll off the second it stops flattering them. If you're genuinely built for this, you'll feel the pull to stay to the very last word, and one specific annoyance has already come to mind. Now let's go through it step by step. And before we go one step further, understand how this stays standing. There's a link in the description. It's sitting in the pinned comment at the top as well, so you don't have to go hunting for it. That link is the only reason these messages keep getting made. It's held open by chosen ones who decided this work was worth protecting. If this is already doing something in your chest, that's your answer. Support it if you're able. Share the channel if you're not. Both carry the same weight here, and nobody is keeping score. Hit like so this stops getting buried. Subscribe so you never have to find your way back to it, and send this channel to one person who's been carrying something heavy in silence. Now, step by step. Number 1, something small went wrong and you were furious about it. The fury is the part to notice. It's the receipt. Chosen one, let's open this properly, because the size of the reaction is the first clue. Most things that go wrong produce a proportionate response. Something small goes wrong, you're mildly annoyed, and it's gone within an hour. That's the normal pattern, and it accounts for almost everything. Occasionally something small goes wrong and the reaction is enormous. Out of all proportion. You're still angry about it that evening and the next day, and you find yourself telling somebody about it a week later with more heat than the story deserves. Imagine this, a cancellation that cost you very little in practical terms, that you were furious about for 3 days and that you can still describe in detail years later. Imagine this, 50 other cancellations from the same period that you have absolutely no memory of. Or picture a small stone in a shoe producing more reaction than a long walk. And maybe you're wondering, doesn't that just mean I was tired that week? Sometimes. But go and check the retention. Ordinary annoyances don't survive a month in anybody's memory. The ones you can still describe years later, with the feeling still attached, are a different category, and you've got 2 or 3 of them, and they're the subject of this. You weren't overreacting, you were reacting to something with weight in it. The size of the annoyance wasn't the size of the event, it was the size of the redirection. You didn't hold on to it because you're petty. You held on to it because something in you registered that it mattered. And what has holding those grievances actually cost you? More than the obstructions did. That's the arithmetic worth running. Imagine this, an afternoon that was ruined a decade ago, costing you exactly 1 afternoon at the time, and a decade of intermittent anger about it, costing you a few minutes here and there, hundreds of times, adding up to considerably more than the original. Imagine this, a person you've held it against ever since, who has no memory of the incident, and who you've been quietly distant with for years over 4 hours of inconvenience. So what's the actual damage in your history? Not the events, the custody of them. And the universe has never once returned the fee on any of it, and never will. You're not still suffering from those obstructions. You're paying interest on them. You weren't harmed for a decade. You were inconvenienced once and have recharged yourself since. You're not carrying a grievance about an event. You're carrying an event about which nothing further ever happened. The fury is the receipt. Look at which ones you kept. And there's something worth noticing about who delivers these. It's almost never a stranger. Imagine this. The obstruction arriving through somebody you know, a person letting you down, a colleague forgetting something, somebody close to you being unreliable at exactly the wrong moment. Imagine this, why that would be. A stranger's obstruction gets worked around. Somebody you know produces a complication, a conversation, a delay of exactly the right length, and a grievance that sticks hard enough to keep you away. That's why so many of your relocations have somebody's face attached. Not because anybody was working against you, because a person is the most effective instrument available, and they cost nothing to use. Number 2, the annoyance was the mechanism, because nothing else would have moved you. Nothing else works. That's not a claim about you, it's a claim about everybody. Chosen one, this is the design constraint, and understanding it explains the method. To move a person out of a position, you need them to relocate voluntarily, quickly, and without investigating. There are very few things that produce all 3. Persuasion doesn't. Persuasion invites counter-argument. Fear doesn't. Fear produces vigilance, and a vigilant person stays and watches. Imagine this. Somebody being told not to go somewhere. What do? They ask why. And if the answer isn't satisfying, they go anyway. And if it is satisfying, they go and look from a safe distance, which is still the wrong place. Imagine this. The same person hitting an obstruction with no explanation attached. They swear, they reroute, and they're 2 miles away within 20 minutes, thinking about something else entirely. Or picture the difference between a warning sign and a closed road. So you might be asking, couldn't there be a gentler method? Every gentler method has been tried on everybody and none of them works. Gentle nudges get overridden, coincidences get ignored, intuitions get talked out of. The only reliable instrument is an obstruction irritating enough to be obeyed and small enough to be believed, and that combination always feels like being wronged. The annoyance isn't a side effect, it's the mechanism. The irritation isn't incidental, it's the only reliable actuator anybody has. You weren't being punished with an obstruction, you were being moved with the only tool that works. And there's something worth admitting about your own stubbornness here. You'd have gone anyway. Imagine this, somebody suggesting mildly that you shouldn't do the thing you'd planned. You'd have listened politely and gone anyway, and both of you know it. Imagine this, somebody suggesting it firmly. You'd have wanted a reason, and any reason they gave would have been accessible, and you'd have assessed it and gone anyway. Is that a flaw? It's the ordinary condition of anybody who gets anything done. People who can be talked out of things don't complete anything, which means the very quality that has served you everywhere else is the exact reason nothing softer than an obstruction has ever been available for you. You're not being handled roughly for no reason. You're being handled at the setting you require. You're not stubborn in a way that costs you. You're stubborn in a way that determines the method. You're not being denied a gentler approach. You've never once responded to one. Nothing else would have moved you. That's why it came as an annoyance. Hold here for a second, chosen one. You're well past the point where most people scroll away. That says something about what you're actually looking for. If this is reaching you, keep the signal alive. The support link is in the description, and it's pinned at the top of the comments, so it's never more than one tap away. Every contribution that comes through it pays for another message like this one, for somebody who hasn't found their way here yet. Not everyone can give. Nobody here is asking you to. Sharing the channel costs nothing and travels further than money ever does. So take whichever one is yours, like the video, subscribe. Pass this channel to someone who needs to hear that they weren't imagining it, back to it. And there's a reason nobody has ever built a religion around this. It's unusable. Imagine this, a system that only works if the person inside it can't detect it operating. There's nothing to teach, nothing to observe, and no way for anybody to demonstrate anything to anybody else. Imagine this, somebody trying to describe it. Every example they give sounds like ordinary bad fortune, because ordinary bad fortune is exactly what it's designed to look like. That's why this stays private. Everybody who has worked it out has worked it out alone, retrospectively, about their own life, and none of them has ever been able to make it sound like anything to anybody else. Number 3, you can't be warned, because a warning would have made you stay and watch. That's the sentence to hold. A warning produces the opposite of the required behavior. Chosen one, this is the part that explains the silence, so take it slowly. You've asked at some point why nothing is ever explained, why there's never a sign or a signal or a moment of clarity. It's the most reasonable complaint anybody has about any of this. Here's the answer. A warned person doesn't leave. A warned person prepares. Imagine this. Somebody told that something is going to happen at a particular place. They don't stay away. They arrange to be safe there. They watch. They take precautions. Every single one of those responses puts them at the location. Imagine this, the same person given no warning at all, simply not being there, because their train was cancelled and they were furious about it. Or picture the difference between a person who has been told about a hazard and a person who never had the option of going. And maybe you're wondering, wouldn't a sensible person just stay away? Almost nobody stays away from anything on the strength of a warning. That's the finding, and it's remarkably consistent. People stay and prepare and negotiate and go anyway with extra care, and being there with extra care is still being there. Removal is the only thing that removes anybody. You weren't left uninformed. You were left unable to negotiate. You weren't kept in the dark unfairly. You were kept out of the location. You weren't denied a warning. A warning was the one thing guaranteed not to work. And there's a version of this you can test against other people. Watch what happens when anybody gets warned about anything. Imagine this. Somebody being told a person is bad news. They don't avoid them. They get curious. They form their own view. They go and find out carefully, and being careful about somebody bad news is still being near somebody bad news. Imagine this. That same person, if the introduction had simply never happened because of a scheduling problem, never having met them at all. Which of those two outcomes does a warning produce? The first, every single time, in everybody, without exception. That's why nobody in this arrangement has ever been warned about anything, and why everybody thinks that means nobody is watching. You're not unwarned because nothing is watching. You're unwarned because warnings produce approach. You're not being left to it. You're being handled with the only method that works on humans. You're not without guidance. You've been receiving it in the only format that gets obeyed. You can't be warned. Nobody can, and that's why it comes as an obstruction. And there's a further quality these events share. Nobody could ever be held responsible. Imagine this. Every obstruction in your history arriving through a mechanism with no accountable party. A cancellation nobody authorized. A failure nobody could explain. A person acting out of character once for reasons they couldn't articulate afterwards. Imagine this. You trying to complain about it. There's nowhere to send the complaint. There's no decision anybody made, and no name attached to anything. Why does that matter? Because a complaint is an attempt to reverse something, and anything reversible isn't a relocation. Every one of these arrives in a form that has no appeal process anywhere in it. Number 4, it had to be small enough to be believable and large enough to move you. There's a narrow band. Everything in this arrives inside it. Chosen one, this is the calibration, and it's the most elegant part of the whole thing. Too small and you'd have pushed through. A minor inconvenience gets overcome. You'd have been late, but you'd have arrived, and arriving is the outcome being prevented. Too large and you'd have investigated. Something genuinely catastrophic makes a person stop and ask what's happening, and asking leads to explanations, and explanations lead to arguments. The band is narrow, and everything you're thinking about right now sits inside it. Imagine this. Something that cost you an afternoon. Not a week, not an hour. An afternoon, which is enough to be genuinely annoying, and not enough to warrant an inquiry. Imagine this. Every one of your unexplained obstructions being roughly that size. Big enough to have stopped you. Small enough that you never asked anybody anything about it, or picture a hand on a shoulder. Not a shove which produces resistance, not a touch which gets ignored. Exactly enough pressure to turn somebody. So you might be asking, isn't that reading a lot into ordinary inconvenience? Check the sizes. Go through your unexplained obstructions and see how many of them cost you between half a day and a week, and how few of them were either trivial or catastrophic. That distribution isn't what random inconvenience looks like. Random inconvenience is spread evenly across all sizes, and yours won't be. The size wasn't accidental, it was calibrated. The cost wasn't arbitrary, it was set to move you without triggering an investigation. You weren't randomly inconvenienced, you were adjusted precisely. And there's a specific timing feature worth noticing. They arrive at the last moment. Imagine this. Something that falls through the day before, or the morning of, or 40 minutes before you were going to leave. Almost never a month in advance. Imagine this. Why that would be. An obstruction delivered early gets worked around. There's time to rebuild the plan, find another route, arrange something else. Early obstructions get defeated by anybody with any determination. What does late do? Late removes the option. There's no time to rebuild, so the thing simply doesn't happen, and the person is left with an evening they hadn't planned and a grievance they didn't expect. You weren't badly served by the timing. The timing is the whole design. You're not being obstructed at the worst moment. You're being obstructed at the only effective one. You're not the victim of bad scheduling. You're the subject of precise scheduling. There's a narrow band. Everything in this arrives inside it. Number 5. You never found out what was standing where you'd have been. You never will. That's a permanent feature. Chosen one, this is the hardest part of the arrangement, so let's be honest about it. There's no confirmation coming. Not now and not later. You will never learn what would have happened at that place, on that afternoon, if the obstruction hadn't occurred. You'd want it. Everybody wants it, and it isn't available to anybody who has ever lived. Imagine this, somebody delayed by an hour who reads about something the following day and understands immediately what happened. That's the rare version, and it's rare enough that everybody has heard the same handful of stories about it. Imagine this, the far more common version, where nothing visible happened at all, because what was avoided was a person, or a conversation, or a chain of events that would have started that afternoon and taken 4 years to become a disaster. Or picture somebody who has stepped off a path and can no longer see what the path was leading to. And maybe you're wondering, then how am I supposed to believe any of this? You're not being asked to believe anything about a specific instance. What's available is the pattern, and the pattern is checkable. Look at the shape and the size of your unexplained obstructions. Look at the ones you're still angry about. Then ask of each where it put you instead. That's the only evidence anybody in your position has ever had. You're not going to get confirmation. Confirmation isn't part of this. You won't be shown the alternative. Nobody has ever been shown one. You're not lacking evidence. You're lacking the one kind that was never on offer, and there's a category of avoided outcome that's easy to miss. Most of them are people, not events. Imagine this. Something that would have gone wrong not being a collision or a catastrophe, but a meeting. Somebody you'd have been introduced to that afternoon, who would have become part of your life over the following 2 years, and who would have cost you a decade. Imagine this, that being the far more common shape of it, not dramatic. Just a person who never entered your life because you weren't in the room where the introduction would have happened. How would you ever detect that? You couldn't, and neither could anybody. That's why almost nobody believes any of this, and why the few stories people do tell are always about the rare, dramatic version. You weren't being kept from an event. You were being kept from an introduction. You didn't avoid a disaster. You avoided a person, which takes years and leaves no trace. You're not looking for the wrong kind of evidence. You're looking for the visible kind, and this leaves none. You never found out. Nobody ever finds out. And there's one further category worth adding to your page. The things you cancelled yourself. Imagine this, an occasion where you pulled out of something for no reason you could articulate. You weren't ill. Nothing had changed. You simply didn't go, and you felt slightly guilty about it, and you never worked out why you'd done it. Imagine this, that being the same mechanism operating through you rather than around you, which is rarer and considerably harder to detect. How would you tell those apart from ordinary reluctance? By the absence of a reason. Ordinary reluctance always has one available. The ones worth noticing are the ones where you'd have struggled to explain yourself if anybody had asked. Number 6. The same thing has happened several times and you've never linked them more than one. They're spread out, which is why they've never assembled. Chosen one, this is the pattern, and assembling it is the whole exercise. Each obstruction arrived alone, years apart, in completely different circumstances. One was about urgency. One was about an arrangement that fell through. One was about somebody letting you down at the last moment for reasons that never made sense. You've never put them side by side because there's nothing connecting them except a shape. Imagine this, writing them out on one page tonight. 4 items, maybe 5, every one of them unexplained, every one of them roughly the same size, every one of them still carrying heat. Imagine this. Looking at that page and noticing that in each case you can identify what you were prevented from doing, and in not one case can you identify why the prevention occurred. Or picture 4 locked gates on 4 different paths in 4 different years, none of which anybody has ever admitted locking. So you might be asking, isn't that just what life is like? Life is full of inconvenience, and almost all of it is explicable and forgettable. What you're being asked to look at is the specific subset that has no explanation, that arrived at the last possible moment, that was calibrated to exactly the size that moves somebody, and that you're still angry about years later. That subset is small and it's oddly consistent. You're not looking at random events. You're looking at a set with a shape. They're not unconnected. They've never been assembled. You're not seeing patterns in noise. You're seeing a distribution that noise doesn't produce. And there's a specific season worth examining, the stretch where everything went wrong at once. Imagine this, a period in your life where nothing worked. 3 or 4 things fell through in the same few months, and you concluded you were in a bad patch and simply had to get through it. Imagine this, that not being a bad patch at all, but a period of concentrated redirection because you were heading somewhere and multiple routes had to be closed. Have you had one of those? Almost everybody has, once or twice, and everybody remembers them as the worst stretches of their life. And the density of obstruction in them is exactly what you'd expect if something were working hard rather than if something had gone wrong. You weren't in a run of bad fortune. You were in a period of heavy traffic management. You didn't have a cursed year. You had a year with a lot of steering in it. You're not somebody things go wrong for. You're somebody who required a lot of moving in one particular season, several times. You've never once put them together, and there's a question about whether any of this is aimed at you personally. It doesn't need to be. Imagine this. Somebody being moved by an obstruction that had nothing to do with them at all. The road was closed for its own reasons, and they were routed round it, and the routing happened to keep them out of something. Imagine this, that being just as effective as a targeted version, and considerably more common, and completely indistinguishable from it afterwards. Does the difference matter? Not to the outcome. What it changes is how much significance you attach to your own position, and the honest answer is that a great deal of protection arrives entirely impersonally and works exactly as well. Number 7. The resentment is the price of the method. You had to be angry. That's not a flaw in the design, it's a requirement of it. Chosen one, this is the cost, and it's worth understanding what you've been paying. The method only works if you experience it as an injustice. A relocation that felt neutral wouldn't move you. A relocation that felt benevolent would make you suspicious. It has to feel like being wronged, or it doesn't produce the immediate, unquestioning, irritated departure that the whole thing depends on. Which means you've been paying in resentment, years of it in some cases. Imagine this. Somebody still slightly angry, a decade later, at a person who let them down at the last minute over something that no longer matters at all. Imagine this, that person having been the instrument, not a villain, not even a participant really, somebody who was unreliable on one specific afternoon in a way that has been carried as a grievance ever since. Or picture somebody cursing the driver of the vehicle that blocked the junction for years without ever wondering what was coming the other way. And maybe you're wondering, is that fair on the people involved? Nobody in this is being treated fairly, including you. The person who let you down probably did it for their own ordinary reasons and has forgotten completely. You've carried it, and the whole arrangement runs on that carrying, because a resentment is the only thing that makes an obstruction stick hard enough to work. The resentment isn't a side effect. It's the fuel that made you leave. The anger wasn't wasted. It was doing the work. You weren't wrong to be furious. Furious was the required response. And there's somebody you should probably release tonight, the person who was the instrument. Imagine this. Somebody who let you down at the last minute, once years ago, and who you've been quietly cool with ever since. They weren't malicious. They had their own reasons. They've forgotten completely. Imagine this. Them having been the mechanism rather than the cause, and having no more agency in it than a closed road has. Should you tell them any of this? Absolutely not, and there'd be no way to. But you could stop holding it tonight privately without anybody being told, and the only person affected by that would be you. You're not obliged to keep that grievance. It has done its work. You weren't wronged by that person. You were moved through them. You're not letting them off anything. You're closing an account that was never theirs. The resentment is the price. You've been paying it for years. And there's a limit to this idea that's worth stating plainly. Most bad things are just bad things. Imagine this. Somebody taking this message and reading every misfortune in their life as a redirection. Within a year, they'd be unable to grieve anything properly because every loss would be provisionally a gift. Imagine this. That being a worse condition than the one they started in and considerably more damaging over a lifetime. What's the honest proportion? Small. A handful of instances across decades. Everything else is exactly what it appeared to be, and treating it otherwise is a way of avoiding your own history rather than understanding it. Number 8. Some of your worst days were relocations. Not all of them, but some, and probably the ones you'd least expect. Chosen one, this one asks you to look at something painful, so take it carefully. There are days in your history you'd remove if you could. Not small annoyances. Genuinely bad days where something collapsed and you couldn't see any purpose in it at all. At least one of those was a relocation. Possibly more than one. Imagine this. A collapse that took something from you and that you've never been reconciled to. And that collapse having moved you, over the following 6 months, entirely out of a set of circumstances that were heading somewhere you couldn't see from inside them. Imagine this. You never being able to establish which of your bad days was which. Some were simply losses. Some were relocations, and they're indistinguishable from where you're standing permanently. Or picture a diversion that adds 200 miles to a journey and is impossible to be grateful for while driving it. So you might be asking, isn't that just telling people their suffering had a purpose? No, and it's important to be precise. Nothing here says your worst days were good. Some of them were simply bad and had no function at all. What's being said is narrower, that a subset of them relocated you, and that you can't tell which, and that the impossibility of telling is the reason nobody should ever be told their suffering was for something. Some of them were losses, some were relocations. Not all of it was for something, not none of it was either. You're not being asked to be grateful for any of it. You're being told the categories exist. And there's a specific misuse of this idea that you should refuse. Never say it to somebody in the middle of something. Imagine this. Somebody in the worst week of their life being told that this might be a relocation. It lands as a dismissal of what they're going through, and it should, because from inside there's no difference between a loss and a redirection, and only the person inside it gets to decide what it is. Imagine this. The same idea arriving years later to somebody who has come out the other side and is trying to make sense of the shape of their life. When is this useful? Only in retrospect, only privately, and only by the person it happened to. Anybody who offers it to somebody else in real time is comforting themselves rather than the person in front of them. You're not being handed something to say to people. You're being handed something to consider about your own history. You're not required to apply this to anybody else's suffering. You couldn't and shouldn't. You're not being told your bad days had a purpose. You're being told the categories exist and are indistinguishable. Some of your worst days moved you. You'll never know which. And there's a question worth asking about what you'd do with one item. Just one. Not the list. Imagine this. Somebody tells you what one specific obstruction saved you from. A single confirmed instance with the alternative outcome attached. Imagine this. What that would do to every subsequent inconvenience in your life. You'd read all of them. Every delay would carry a possible meaning, and you'd never again be able to be simply annoyed by anything. Would one item be safe? It wouldn't. One is enough to convert an entire life into interpretation, and the arrangement appears to know that, which is why nobody has ever been given even one. Number 9, you'll never get the list, and the list is the reason you're still here. There's a list. It has no reader. Chosen one, this is the position you're actually in, and it's worth seeing clearly. If somebody handed you a complete account tonight of every relocation in your life, with the alternative outcomes attached, you'd read it once and never be the same. You'd also stop moving. That's the reason it isn't handed to anybody. Imagine this. Somebody who can see every avoided outcome, they'd be unable to make a decision. Every obstruction would become a message to be interpreted, every inconvenience a sign to be read, and within a year they'd be paralyzed by significance. Imagine this, you instead going through your ordinary life, irritated by things, unable to interpret any of it, and therefore still able to move freely. Or picture somebody who has been shown every near miss on a road they drive daily. And maybe you're wondering, wouldn't I handle it better than that? Nobody handles it better than that. The not knowing isn't a withholding, it's the condition that allows a person to keep operating. What you're calling the frustration of this arrangement is the exact feature that keeps you functional inside it. You're not being denied the list, you're being kept mobile. The information isn't withheld out of cruelty, it's withheld out of necessity. You're not missing something you'd benefit from, you'd be immobilized by it inside a year. And there's a related mercy in not being able to see forward. You'd stop taking any risks at all. Imagine this. Being able to see which of your current plans is heading somewhere bad. Within a month you'd be checking everything and consulting nothing and refusing to commit to anything without a reading. Imagine this. The version of you that exists instead, which commits to things on ordinary evidence, and gets obstructed occasionally and is furious about it and keeps moving. Which of those gets anywhere? Only the second, and the not knowing is precisely what makes it possible. Every complaint anybody has ever made about the opacity of this arrangement is a complaint about the feature that keeps them functional. You're not being kept ignorant, you're being kept willing to move. You're not denied foresight, you're spared paralysis. You're not lacking information, you're carrying exactly as much as a person can carry and still act. There's a list. It has no reader, and it never will, and there's a picture worth holding before the end. Imagine this. A junction on an ordinary afternoon. In a year you've half forgotten. 2 routes available. One of them closed for no reason anybody explained, and you taking the other one and swearing about it for 20 minutes. Imagine this, everything that has happened in your life since having come down the second route. Every person you met after that afternoon, every arrangement you're currently inside. Imagine this, the first route still being there in some sense, running parallel, containing a completely different version of the last decade, and being permanently unavailable to anybody's inspection. That's the shape of it, not a wall. A junction with one side closed. At an hour you were too annoyed to notice anything. Number 10. You weren't obstructed, you were moved. 2 words, the same event and a completely different account of your life. Chosen one, this is the last one, and it's the one to carry out. Obstruction is an account in which the world is against you. Things go wrong, plans fail, and somebody adding up your history would find a pattern of interference and conclude that you've had a hard run of it. Relocation is the same set of events with the direction reversed. Nothing was stopped. Things were moved. and the moving was aimed at where you'd be rather than at what you were doing. Imagine this. Going through your history under the first account, it produces a specific person, slightly braced, slightly expecting things to fall through, somebody who has learned that plans are fragile and that effort gets interfered with. Imagine this, the same history under the second account, same events, same losses, same anger at the time, and a completely different conclusion at the end of it about what has been happening around you all this time. Or picture the difference between a wall and a hand on your shoulder, which feel identical from behind. So you might be asking, how do I know which account is true? You can't establish it, and nobody can, and anybody who tells you they can is selling something. What you can do is notice that both accounts fit every fact you have, that only one of them is checkable against the shape and size of what happened, and that you've been living inside the other one for years without ever having chosen it. You weren't obstructed, you were moved. Nothing was stopped, something was avoided. You didn't have a run of interference. You had a series of relocations at a cost in resentment you've been paying ever since. And there's one last thing, and it's about what changes tomorrow. The next obstruction will feel exactly the same. Imagine this, something falling through soon at the last minute for no reason anybody can explain. You'll be furious. Nothing in this message will prevent that, and it shouldn't, because the fury is the mechanism and it needs to work. Imagine this. 3 days later, when it has cooled, one additional question arriving that you've never asked before. Not what did this stop? What did it move me away from? Does that change anything? It changes what you carry afterwards, which is the entire cost of these events. The obstruction lasts an afternoon. The account you build of it lasts years. You're not going to stop being angry. You shouldn't and you can't. You're not being asked to be grateful in the moment. Nobody could be. You're only being handed a second question to ask 3 days later, and it's the only part of this that has ever been in anybody's control. You were moved. That's the whole correction. And now, chosen one, everything comes full circle. Go back to the beginning of this. Something went wrong. Small, ordinary, and infuriating. And you were angry about it for longer than the size of it justified. That anger has been sitting in you ever since, attached to a person or an organization or an afternoon, and it has never once been resolved, because there was nothing to resolve it with. Nobody explained anything, nobody could have. An annoyance is the only instrument that reliably moves a person. Not a warning, which produces preparation, not an explanation, which produces argument. An irritation, calibrated to exactly the size that gets obeyed without being investigated, delivered by somebody ordinary who had their own ordinary reasons and has long since forgotten. You were moved several times at long intervals by different mechanisms. You've never assembled the instances because they arrived years apart in unrelated circumstances, and each one felt like a single piece of bad fortune rather than part of anything. Nobody's going to confirm this. There's no list coming, no explanation, no moment where somebody shows you what was standing where you'd have been. And the absence of that information isn't a cruelty. It's the condition that lets you keep moving through your life without reading significance into everything. What you've got is the shape. The obstructions that never got explained, the ones you're still angry about, the narrow band of size they all sit in, where each one put you instead of where you were going. That's the evidence, and it's the only kind there is, and it's been in your own history the whole time. Imagine this, a page with 2 columns. On the left, everything that has ever been prevented. On the right, everywhere you consequently weren't. You've been reading the left column your whole life, and the right one has never once been written. Stop counting your obstructions. Start counting where you weren't standing. Your rise isn't coming. It's been moving you off spots for longer than you'd believe, one annoyance at a time. If this message hit home, chosen one, like the video, subscribe, drop 77 in the comments, and share this with someone who's been cursing the thing that saved them.